Thank you very much for coming back to the second session on these lectures on focus. So this morning we talked about general description of focus as a phenomenon, and we started to discuss questions of how we study focus particles, look at their distribution, where focus particles can occur, and where the corresponding focus associate can be at that same time. So I generally refer to that as patterns of association. And as we saw, there are various restrictions on that. So we're going to be looking at some more patterns of association, looking at that geometry in this session today. If you're looking at the handout, which again should line up, I'm on page 16. So we're going to be looking, I want to share two case studies this afternoon. So both from my own work, one on Vietnamese and one on English. And the core questions driving this that I will set up first is, are these patterns of association explained by the syntax, or are they explained by the semantics? Or do we need both, right? And to start, I want to point out or highlight again that this morning I mentioned that the alternative semantics framework of Ruth already makes certain predictions. So it predicts that if we have a contentful operator or a contentful focus semantic operator, then it's in the sister of that operator, so in the C command domain of that operator, that we expect the focus to be, and there should be a sensitivity to focus in that position. But as we mentioned this morning as well, things can be complicated by some things that we describe as focus particles actually not being the locus of its semantics. We'll see that more tomorrow. But here today, with that in mind, I'll be looking at a couple case studies that are a little bit better behaved than that. Our first case study is going to be on Vietnamese, which we had some good discussion of this morning, so we'll look at that a little bit further. So in Vietnamese, as introduced this morning, there are two focus particles that are traditionally translated as only. There's actually, in fact, also a third item, this sentence final particle, which I won't be including here. But there are these two focus particles, so chi and moi, and descriptively in their syntactic distribution, we can say that chi is a sentential only and moi is a constituent only. So again, example 51 is repeated from above. So you can have, in order to express Nam only bought the book, you can say Nam chi mua quen cha or Nam mua moi quen cha. But interestingly, you can also say Nam chi mua moi quen cha. And that also means the same thing, that all of those can mean Nam only bought the book, right? So when they co-occur, there has to be descriptively some kind of concord relationship. I analyzed this previously, and I will continue to do so by talking about this as chi being the operator which sits on the clausal spine and associates with focus. So it looks at its alternatives in its sister and associates with focus. Chi is actually the position of the semantic operator, and moi is just some morphosyntactic flag that says I am near a overt or covert chi sentential operator. I'll give you an additional piece of evidence for this description in terms of them being, in terms of moi being actually a constituent particle closer to a focused constituent and chi necessarily being on the clausal spine. And that comes from the behavior, for example, in subject position. So in a subject-only example, like only Nam bought the book, here again, there are multiple ways of saying this. You can say moi Nam bought the book, chi Nam bought the book, or chi moi Nam bought the book. Again, means the same thing. Moi chi Nam is ungrammatical. Moi chi Nam bought the book is just rejected. Right? And why would this be? Well, this is quite straightforward again from the view that moi is a constituent focus particle. It has to glom onto the focused phrase or focus containing phrase, which is subsentential. Moi generally does not sit on the clausal spine. Chi is always on the clausal spine, and therefore the linear order that we observe has to be chi moi nam, as in 52C. It can't be moi chi nam. That's just not something that we can build. And now what we're interested in is, again, playing the only game, right? Seeing where in a sentence you can put a focus particle and what it can associate with. And so I've schematized a lot of data together in 53, but let me walk through this. So here is a baseline simplex sentence with no clausal embedding, where we have this baseline word order, yesterday Num bought the book. And there are 3 places that you can put chi in this sentence. So it can be chi yesterday, Num bought the book, yesterday chi Num bought the book, yesterday Num chi bought the book. Chi is ungrammatical in the postverbal position, inside the VP. So now, in each of these positions, the choice of focus associate is different. So in the clause initial position, what only can associate with has to be yesterday or the entire proposition. And here I'm only looking at the distribution of chi, but correspondingly you can have moi on yesterday, but you can't have moi on another constituent unless you're interpreting it as a separate instance of only. But that's rather marked. If chi is in pre-subject position, then it has to associate with the subject. There's no other option. If chi is in a pre-verbal position, now you can associate with anything in the VP. So that could be the entire VP, it can be the verb, it can be the object. What I want to highlight here is the interesting restrictiveness of this distribution. Remember that based on what we've already introduced, chi clearly is a sentential focus particle. It clearly sits on the clausal spine, and therefore the semantics should predict that it should be sensitive to focus anywhere inside its sister. It should only be restricted by the classic C command restriction on sentential focus particles like English preverbal only. But instead, that's not what we see. We see that chi in pre-subject position has to associate with the subject. Chi before yesterday has to associate with yesterday or the entire proposition, right? Chi in pre-subject position cannot narrowly associate with book, for example. And this is surprising, again, from that semantics. I'm going to dwell on this just a moment longer. If we were looking at a language like English and just looking at the distribution of only, then we have another option, which is to say, well, okay, there are 2 different kinds of onlys. We already know this from object position, for example, because you can say, I only bought the book, or I bought only the book. So there clearly are constituent and sentential variants of a single word only in English. We might try an approach like that in Vietnamese as well, at first glance, when we encounter data like in 53. But the challenge is we know that Vietnamese has a constituent only, and it's pronounced differently. It's pronounced moi. We know that. It's pronounced differently, and therefore we know when we look at a sentence like yesterday chi nam bought the book, that chi is not a constituent particle, it's a sentential particle. We know that from the distribution of these items separately. We know from the position, their relative position when they co-occur, how they co-occur, for example, in 52, as we just saw. So I'm building this up, but what this tells us then is that something else has to be going on. There has to be something syntactic going on. The semantics alone is not going to explain this distribution, the pattern of association of chi here. I'm going to deepen the mystery with this extra data, which is that it turns out that if we have a clausal embedding, then now the position of qi associating with a fixed position of focus now is not totally restricted. There is optionality in the position of qi, but in particular in the following way. So both of these sentences in 54 and 55 are built on the baseline of the form I say that Nam likes ngan, with narrow focus on ngan. I'm going to fix a position of focus on ngan, and now I want to see, okay, where can we put qi to associate with ngan? And now it turns out you can put it higher in the higher clause before say, or you can put it lower in the lower clause before like. So now there is apparent surface optionality in those positions. They mean different things. 54 and 55 mean different things, as indicated by their translations as well. We'll come back to that in a moment. But clearly there's something interesting going on here, especially when we compare this to the previous examples in 53 in that diagram. Because in 53, I'll go back to it for a moment, I started by describing this by saying, let's put qi in different positions and see what they can associate with. Another way of playing this game is to say, let's try putting focus on a particular place and seeing where we can put qi to associate with that focus. And we see in this example in 53, it's 1-to-1. So if you pick focus on a particular place, there is only one place that you can put qi to associate with it. And that's what's different when we introduce a embedded clause. So based on this and further data, in this 2017 paper, I proposed that the Vietnamese sentential focus particles, including qi, follows the generalization in 56. That sentential focus particles in Vietnamese must be as low as possible while C-commanding their focus associate within a given phase. Now that last part is important because it's a way of understanding the data that we just saw in the previous slide in 54 and 55. The apparent optionality of the focus particle placement in a lower clause or higher clause I attribute to the fact that the lower clause and higher clause are in different cycles, let's say in different phases. And in the full paper, I have some additional arguments showing specifically that it's not just about finite clauses, but it actually is a little bit more granular than that, and therefore we want to refer to it as low as possible within a phase. Interestingly, similar as low as possible requirements for the placement of sentential focus particles are described in a particular approach to the analysis of focus particles in German, in particular from Jakob's work and made famous by Buring and Hartmann. And also I've analyzed certain focus particles in Mandarin Chinese as having exactly this behavior as well. And there's a recent manuscript version of that. An alternative way of thinking about this would be to say, well, when you had that embedded clause in 54 and 55, what you changed was that now when you put qi higher or lower, they mean different things. And maybe it's that you introduce this optionality specifically because putting them in different positions gives you different meanings. So what this would look like would be hypothesis 57. So here's a semantically sensitive version of the generalization I gave, which is that a sentential focus particle must be as low as possible while C-commanding its focus and deriving the intended truth conditions. So if we, in 54 and 55, if we wanted a only say interpretation, well then you have to have it as low as possible while staying above say and associating with the embedded object. But if you want a say only interpretation, well then it can stay even lower. And this harkens back to this idea of scope economy from Danny Fox's work and much subsequent work, including work at this conference presented, I think, tomorrow morning. This idea that scope shifting operations cannot be semantically vacuous, or in this case, we don't have to necessarily think about it as movement, that if you have different options for merging an adjunct, a sentential adjunct, then somehow there is some pressure that says you want it to be as low as possible, and a way to get around that, a way to actually violate being as low as possible, is if by violating it you lead to a different meaning. So in this paper on Vietnamese, I argue that that cannot be the case, that this has to be a much more just syntactic, brutally syntactic requirement. And the evidence comes from interactions with subject quantifiers. So 59 is a baseline showing what happens when you have a subject quantifier and only. So this is a subject quantifier that's a WH expression. So we have WH and preverbal also. Together gives you a universal quantifier. So who also is everyone. And then we have chi by the book. This is scopally unambiguous. This has to mean that everyone only bought the book. It does not mean only the book is such that everyone bought it. Now in this case, if we could build chi higher using the straightforward sentential focus particle operator semantics for chi, and we can take that and put it higher, and it associates with the book across the universal quantifier, then the semantics for focus alternatives and sentential onlys introduced this morning, that is very well adopted, that predicts that the semantics should have no problem. That is example 60, and it's ungrammatical. It predicts that the semantics should be fine. It can associate with the object across a quantifier, and it should mean, though, a different meaning. It should mean only the book is such that everyone bought it. And yet, it's simply ungrammatical in Vietnamese. Right? And in case you're wondering, in order to actually build this meaning, what you have to do in Vietnamese is you have to actually reorganize the clause. You can do it straightforwardly by actually moving the object up. So you can say, only the book everyone bought. And then you're now going to get the intended interpretation, and you have not violated chi being as low as possible. So the takeaway from this case study is that the distribution of sentential focus particles in Vietnamese is governed by as low as possible constraint, relativized to some notion of cycle. I said phase here. And in particular, this has to be a syntactic constraint. This has to be a brutally syntactic constraint that says, I need to be as low as possible while taking my intended focus in my scope. So that's the first case study I wanted to share with you. If there are any immediate clarifications, I can take some now, but otherwise I can move on to the second case study. Okay, maybe I can keep going, and then we'll certainly have time for questions.
Sorry. I have a quick question.
Yes.
So if we're looking at 55, for example, is there a reason, and maybe I missed this, is there a reason why chi doesn't come up right before nan?
So thank you. Right before the object, is that right?
Yes.
So chi is a sentential focus particle. It always is on the clausal spine. It cannot come inside the VP.
So the lowest possible position has to be VP then?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
There is, in case there are Vietnamese speakers, there are certain constructions where you get chi closer to the object in a post-verbal position. I have some discussion of an example of that in the full paper, but I think that's a different construction. That's actually embedding a separate clause. So, but yes, that's the answer to the question. I hope that made sense.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Any other clarifications on the Vietnamese? If not, I'll move on to the second case study for this afternoon, which is from English. All right, so this is the next section, page 19 of the handout. So this has to do with association with moved material. So one thing that Jackendoff observes in this 1972 book, this classic that has this one of the earliest studies of patterns of focus association, is he notes that in English, even and also, but not only, can associate from that sentential particle position, that preverbal position, with a leftward subject. So the contrast, a simple contrast is in 61, so a professor will only come to the party. To mean a professor will come to the party, a student won't, it's false that a student will come, it's false that a parent will come, etc. That reading, that intended reading, is ungrammatical. It's unavailable in 61A. In contrast, a professor will even come to the party, or a professor will also come to the party. Those are totally natural. So there's a question there of why that is. It appears, and there are two puzzles here. One is, again, if we assume that a professor originated inside the scope of only, which Jackendoff did not, but if we assume that, then we learn that only cannot associate with something that's moved out. But there's a second puzzle, which is why even and also can associate with something which apparently is outside of its scope, in violation of the general C-command requirement on focus particles, which, at least for sentential particles, as we talked about this morning, we have very good semantic motivation for. And I want to highlight, this was not noted by Jackendoff, but I'll highlight that that there's a contrast. The contrast in 61 neatly parallels other forms of movement out of the position of focus particles in English as well. So for example, here's a contrast from topicalization. So in 62, John they only consider intelligent. To mean they only consider John intelligent is bad, but John they even consider intelligent is good, as noted by Kane in a footnote. Or John they also consider intelligent. Those are fine. So again, we have both of these puzzles. So as I noted, with the VP internal subject hypothesis, which Jackendoff didn't have in the 70s, then the data that we just saw in 61 and 62 can be unified. There's a unified description, which is that only, sentential only in English, cannot associate with material which has moved out, but even and also can. And the observation that the lower position is actually crucial as well, further evidence for that comes from a difference between raising and control. So here's one argument for that in 63. So a professor seems to even be at the party is fine, versus a professor wants to even be at the party is quite strange. Again, with the intended interpretation, I will flag that it's very easy for speakers to understand 63b, even the way I pronounced it, with a different interpretation, where you have independent focus on professor, and then even somehow is associating with the party or something like that. But that's the only type of interpretation you can get to reparse that in 63b. The intended interpretation, where even associates with a professor, is unavailable in 63. In 63a, in 63b, the control structure, but it's available in 63a. And this, again, is explained under the view that raising involves movement, leaving some sort of copy, some sort of trace, and the control construction does not have that lower copy. Or if it involves some sort of movement, as in perhaps the movement theory of control, it doesn't have a rich representation. It doesn't have a full copy trace. So the overall question then is this configuration in 65, which I describe as associating backwards. So can the focused constituent, the focus associate, move out of the scope of a associating focus sensitive operator? And I'll note that in previous work, it generally was described, configurations of this form were generally described or assumed to be simply ungrammatical across the board. There interestingly is some work in the Germanic literature suggesting that such patterns were possible. But that was the state of the art. And what I'm going to share with you now is based on my dissertation from 2014, where I really tried to better understand, in particular, this contrast in English between even and also on the one hand and only on the other. So my proposal there was, let's adopt the copy theory of movement. Let's take seriously that traces leave full copies. And then, when a focus-sensitive operator appears to associate backwards, as is possible in English with even and also, but not only, it's not because you're associating with the focus which is actually higher, but instead it's that you're associating with the focus which is in the operator's scope, but is unpronounced. So, to schematize this in 66, in the narrow focus, in a copy theory of movement, you have a lower position in the scope of the operator, you move to the higher position, you have copies, and in PF, you only pronounce the higher position for overt movement. But in the logical form, you actually have both copies, and in particular, you have an F-marked copy in the scope of focus, in the scope of the focus operator, and that's why the focus-sensitive operator, the focus particle, actually can continue to associate with it, at least in the case of even and also. And we'll see what happens, what goes wrong in the case of only. So I have to describe a little bit more background just to get everybody on the same page. So as probably is well known, there's a problem with interpreting copy chains at logical form. So at logical form, if we create a copy chain, then the lower copy has to be converted into some form that can actually be interpreted, because we can't have multiple quantificational positions. So a common way of doing this is the technology of trace conversion, which says that lower copies will be converted into definite description bound variables. Specifically, the way this works is illustrated in 67. So, for example, if we do QR for the object in John read every book, then in narrow syntax what we do is we copy every book, so we end up with every book, John read every book. At PF, we pronounce the lower position. And at LF, what we do is we interpret the higher position as is, and the lower position we manipulate, and we change into a definite description bound variable. So the book X. So we're changing the quantifier the quantifier every to the, and inserting this extra restriction on its domain to be equal to the variable X, and that's going to be bound by this lambda abstractor, which is introduced with the movement. So now, what is the difference between even and also and only? I claim that the difference that matters actually is their semantic contribution. Even uses its focus alternatives, and also as well, but I'm just going to illustrate with even. Even uses focus alternatives in its scope to introduce a not at issue inference. This is commonly described as a presupposition, a scalar presupposition of even, expressing that something about the relative unlikeliness or noteworthiness of the prejacent. In particular, that the prejacent proposition is less likely or more noteworthy than its alternatives. And crucially, even does not change the truth conditions of the assertion. It just passes up the at-issue content of its sister. Only actually uses the alternatives, quantification over the alternatives, to create a new truth condition, to create a new at-issue meaning. Remember, what only does, the simple version, is that it will say those non-projacent alternatives are all false, and that actually is a new truth condition that it's creating. The projacent proposition of its sister is then introduced as a presupposition. Crucially, at-issue content which is created with only then will compose with further material upwards, whereas not at-issue content such as presupposition will not compose with material upwards, it will just project. So we'll walk through this. So what I'm doing in 68 is schematizing, in the general case, the examples we saw above. A professor will operator come to the party, where professor is F-marked and started in a VP internal position and moves to its surface position. In the narrow syntax, that means we copy it. And when we copy it, we end up with a representation where we have this F marking in both positions. The higher F marked position, we know it's F marked because that's where we actually pronounce focus. The lower F marked position is going to be important actually for the interpretation of focus particles in backwards association. If we take this structure in 68A and then at LF we apply trace conversion to the lower copy, we end up with the representation a professor, lambda x, and then focus particle, that operator, and then lower we have the professor x come to the party with focus on professor. And so when we look at the complement of the focus particle, we're going to look at what the focus particle looks at. It has a sister with an ordinary value, a projacent value, which is the proposition, the professor X comes to the party. Let's say professor contrasts narrowly with student in the discourse context. And therefore, we have the alternatives in the scope of the operator, which are the proposition that the professor X comes to the party and the proposition that the student X comes to the party. And we notice in particular that these alternatives include this bound variable X, or, well, within the scope of the operator, it's an unbound variable. It's going to get bound by the lambda abstractor higher. But that's what the focus particle, only, even, or also, is going to have to look at and compute its meaning. And here's how it will do so. So even, again, introduces a not at issue meaning, let's say a presupposition, which will then be introduced and not compose with material above it, in the way that presuppositions generally do. Presuppositions project through higher content. It will have to deal with the unbound variable in some way, and I proposed and argue at length in my dissertation that in such situations, even and also will then bind that unbound variable with generic quantification. Only instead will take the alternatives in its sister and create a new truth condition, which will then compose with material above it. Let's see how this works. So if the operator is even, what even will introduce when even is interpreted is it will introduce a scalar presupposition, a scalar inference, that says generic x, meaning basically almost all x, or for all x tolerating some exceptions, the proposition that x is a professor and comes to the party, right? That's the professor x comes to the party, unpacking its presupposition. That is less likely than the proposition that x is a student and comes to the party. So what does that mean? We're going to quantify over different individuals relevant in the domain and say for all of them or almost all of them, it is less likely that they are a professor and comes to the party than that they are a student and comes to the party. And that's a little convoluted way of saying this, but essentially what this comes down to then is an overall scalar inference that feels like generally it is less likely for you to be a professor and come to the party than for you to be a student and come to the party. And that accords with our intuitions for the interpretation of this sentence. Crucially, once even does this, calculates this scalar presupposition, this scalar inference, and introduces it, now it's done. And even then takes the truth conditions, the actual at-issue content of its sister, and just passes it up. That includes a unbound variable, but that will be bound by the higher lambda abstractor and then be bound by the professor higher copy. And then we end up with the just at-issue assertion, a professor came to the party, or future, a professor will come to the party, together with this presupposition that it's less likely to be a professor and come to the party than to be a student and come to the party. What if we have only instead? Remember that the simple version is that only will create a new assertion, creates a new truth condition that says the negation of the non-prejacent alternatives, the negation of the other alternatives are true. And then that will create a new at-issue meaning, a new ordinary value that then composes with further material above it. What happens in this situation in 70? So in the logical form, what we'll do is, I've just copied this logical form here. A professor will only the professor X come to the party. And now if we unpack the meaning of only, what does only mean? Well, in a context where professor just has one local alternative, which is student, if we unpack this meaning, only means the negation of its alternative. Its truth conditions don't make reference to the prejacent. So we unpack that, and that tells us that there is a professor X such that the student X didn't come to the party. And this is a very strange meaning. This is a very strange meaning because we have quantification over professors that will then bind this bound variable definite description that says X, there is a professor X such that the student X did or did not come to the party. And so if we assume that the set of professors and students are disjoint, then the higher and lower copies of this same chain will introduce conflicting requirements on the variable, and that leads to a semantic anomaly. So in my dissertation, I have a lot of discussion spelling out a couple things. So first of all, spelling out that there continues to be a problem of this form, a logical problem of this form, even in cases where the two alternatives aren't necessarily completely disjoint. It's just, I illustrate in 70 here because it's particularly clear. The problem is intuitively particularly clear in cases where the prejacent and its alternative feel naturally like disjoint sets. But even if they're not completely disjoint, there is a logical problem that comes about. And second of all, I describe in more precisely what the nature of this problem actually is. And in particular, the nature of this problem is a semantic problem, but it is a certain kind of fatal presupposition failure. It's a kind of logical failure such that the intuition that we get based on interpreting sentences of this form is not just to say that we want to give it a hash mark, that it's infelicitous, but rather that it actually is ungrammatical, that we give it a star. And that follows work by John Gaevsky and colleagues in particular that has claimed that certain types of just fatal infelicity, some sorts of meanings that just systematically, because of their logical nature, cannot contribute a valid meaning. Those types of sentences actually are judged by speakers not just as infelicitous, but actually as ungrammatical. So again, I will refer you to the dissertation for more of those details, but I'd also be happy to talk about those details in the question period. So what do we take away from this case study? The point of this case study then is that patterns of grammatical and ungrammatical backwards association have to be explained then, or can be explained by independent differences in the semantics of these operators. So that's this session. Again, 2 case studies showing interesting differences in patterns of association cross-linguistically, and we have to do a lot of work, it turns out, to really convince ourselves, I think, in each particular case, is this a semantic problem? Is this a semantic restriction? Or is this a syntactic restriction? And it turns out languages have both types of restrictions that end up giving us particular attested patterns of focus association. So that's this session, and I'd be happy to take any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Much for your great lecture, Professor Michael Yoshitaka or Loine. Do you have questions about the lecture?
Hi, Mitchell.
Hi, Tommy.
Yeah, hi. I just have a question on. I was looking at 65, associating backwards. So I was wondering, what could be the reason for languages that allow for associating backwards, and those do not allow for associating backwards? If we assume copy theory of movement, and we also copy that feature.
So that's a great question. So the sort of approach that I describe here says that basically under the copy theory, if you have these copies, then it's going to just be restricted by what the predicted interpretation is. So there are, I think, 2 points of variation potentially. So one is whether that lower copy actually is present or not at LF, right? And so that is something that could vary. I should step back. Both whether the lower copy is present and whether the higher copy is present, right? So that at LF is 1 point of variation. And the second point of variation is in potential differences in the meaning of particles themselves. So the first one is a point of variation I thought more about in my dissertation. So it turns out, for example, that the reason for these citations here, the reason for the discussion in the German literature, is that it has been documented before that actually when you have movement out of only in German or Dutch, you can actually continue to associate with the particle. But as I show in my dissertation, actually there's a property of that, which is that kind of movement that is possible, first of all, specifically, interestingly, it's movement only to the pre-field position. So scrambling in the middle field in German does not have this behavior, apparently. But movement to the pre-field at least has the option, it seems, of being totally reconstructed. So the idea would be maybe it's a post-syntactic movement, or maybe it's a movement that just does happen in the narrow syntax, but then you completely delete the higher copy. And when you do that, then it will just behave as if it never moved out. And in contrast, in English, interestingly, in English, both a movement and a bar movement, at least according to this analysis in my dissertation, has to be such that both the higher and lower copies are actually interpreted in some way, right? Their domains are interpreted in both positions, because that's why even and also can associate with the lower position, and that's why you get this conflict with only. The other difference yeah, okay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I mean that reminds me of like the notion of radical reconstruction in the Japanese literature. Like, I was just wondering if like we observe the same effects of like the German and the Dutch examples, like where we for some reason displace the focus phrase, like separating it from the focus particle in Japanese. That will be also get the associating backwards effect.
So the test case is a little bit tricky to construct. This is something I thought about a long time ago for Japanese, but as was brought up, for example, in the preceding talk by Sato Yosuke. In Japanese, at least the much more natural uses of focus particles are as constituent particles. And so therefore, it's just natural. It's very difficult to actually strand, I want to say impossible, to strand a constituent focus particle and move its sister. But there are potentially sentential focus particles that show up as part of or inside the verbal complex. And those would be the test cases. But then there's also a further challenge also, which was related to discussion in the preceding talk, of actually identifying, being certain about what the height of that particle is, that operator is, as it's part of the verbal complex in Japanese. And so this is something that I thought a little bit about before, but I think there are sort of systematic challenges to really clearly look at this.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. So someone should take this on and think about this more systematically in other languages. I think that would be wonderful. But that was as much as I had thought about it when I was working on this before. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah. I was wondering about the function of the particle. So that's in relation to the first case study, which is for Vietnamese. So your point that Moe is only like its only function is like a morphosyntactic flag, right? Saying that hey, there is an operator nearby that I need to associate with.
Yes.
But then you can pronounce either the operator or the particle. So in the event that you pronounce only the operator, it seems like in that situation the particle is redundant. So if that's the case, then why would we actually need to have the particle as a flag? I guess it's more of a conceptual question.
Yeah, but it's certainly a question to ask. I think I don't have anything deep or particularly precise to say about this, except to note that languages do encode this kind of redundancy in the signal, right? So languages have concord, we have agreement. There is information that is realized in multiple positions. And from a functionalist perspective, that probably actually has, at least in many circumstances, a disambiguating effect or some sort of informational weight such that it is actually useful to do so. But we do tolerate things that are redundant, even in systematic ways. And so that appears to be what's going on in not just Vietnamese, but this morning we saw in La Vukaleve, in German Sign Language. There are a number of languages like this that systematically allow you to pronounce the particle and operator simultaneously. Why some languages allow such options and why others do not is a really great, deep question that I don't have anything to say about right now. But I think it's something we should be thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 minutes for further discussion. Any other question or comment?
Thank you for your lecture. Okay. I'm thinking about the Korean case. We have, in some sense, Vietnamese is similar to Korean. We have two focus morphology like 단지, 만, right? So it seems to me that G seems correspond to Korean 단지 or only or 오로지, and the other 모이 sounds like Korean man. So for the example 54, G yesterday, 모이 남봇 books. So in Korean case, I think 단지 and man both seems like constituent only rather than one is sentence only and sentential only, the other is constituent. So at present, according to my intuition, G and mo are corresponding to Korean only and man, 단지, man, both always go together with the one constituent. So I don't think 단지 works as sentential focus, and the other one works as constituent focus. Because the example like 54, so if we say in the case of 54, I only said nam last ligan, 나는 단지 남이 니간을 좋아한다고 말했다. In this case, we are very confusing whether 단지 appears in matrix clause or embedded clause before nam. So in the case of only appears matrix clause, it doesn't give focus on ligan. It seems to give to the focus the above said. 나는 단지 남이 리간을 좋아한다고 말했다. So, but if I think only appears in the embedded clause before nam, then I can get the interpretation as 나는 단지 only 남이 리간을 좋아한다고 말했다. So in a sense, Korean has two focus morphologies, 단지 and 만, but these two seem to appear always together, it's very difficult to make them separate. So at first time, I think Vietnamese is very similar to Korean, but after the consideration, it has somehow different point a lot. So I don't know how to handle these kind of things. So have you think about Korean case before?
So
Before?
I haven't specifically thought about the Korean case, so thank you for bringing that up. What it makes me think of, though, is actually, I mean, the facts in Vietnamese might not be so different. The original, in this project, I really was focused on establishing that chi is a sentential focus particle, and then looking at the behavior of chi, and then I stopped talking about moi, right? And
let me ask you a question. So based
yes.
on Vietnamese case, you get the idea of in English only has two different things. One is sentential only. The other, there is another only, which is constituent only. So your claim seems to be based on Vietnamese case. Is what I'm thinking. So Vietnamese examples can be some crucial evidence for your claim that there are two different onlys in English. No. Only in English case only rarely has two cases like sentential only and
Yes.
constituent only. How can you get that kind of intuition? Only has two different only. One is sentential only, the other is that's the constituent only.
So the behavior of sentential and constituent only in English behaves very differently. So I mean, they differ in terms of their syntax, what they form constituents with, and what they can associate with, and how they take scope. So those are some things that I introduced this morning. And so it's true, in English you can't pronounce both at the same time, and they're pronounced the same, and so it's more challenging just specifically from English to say that these are two different kinds of things, right? I want to return to. Sorry?
In the case of sentential only in English, everything only C command can be focused, right?
That's right.
In the case of sentential only, but in the case of constituent only, it just appear right before that constituent, right?
It still doesn't have to be.
It's still C command, but it has very narrow scope of constituent, right?
It's so it's limited. It's much more limited in terms of where the focus can be. Yes. So I want to go back, I think, to the Korean point with danji and man, because I think the Vietnamese is actually not that different. That's what I.
Danji and man, danji.
Yes, danji.
Danji, yes.
Mm-hmm. So in these cases in Vietnamese, where you have chi and moi and they can co-occur, this is very natural in when they are in the same clause. But in long distance examples, like in you were asking about 24 and 25. So like in 24, where chi is higher and associates with an embedded object, that's fine. But the speakers I consulted before are not so happy then also putting moi on the embedded object at the same time. So the pronunciation there may itself have some restriction, and it could make sense from the perspective I introduced this morning, that in this operator particle theory, that there's a syntactic dependency between those positions, which might be something like agreement, or it might be something like covert movement. And so we could imagine, it makes sense then that, for example, between danji and man in Korean, it could be similar where there's some kind of clause-bound or phase-bound requirement between those two positions on their pronunciation.
Okay, so yeah, anyway, I need to think more about data. So, in a sense, it's very. At first time, I thought Korean danji and man very similar to Vietnamese, but if we think the more examples, it behaves very differently from Vietnamese cases. So we have. Okay. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.